I want to start by telling you about the day I decided my neighbor was out of her mind. Not because it's fair to her. You'll understand by the end of this exactly how unfair it is. But because I need you to understand how far I had to travel before I believed her, and how close that distance almost cost me everything. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she had lived alone in the pale blue house across the street for as long as I'd lived in mine, 11 years. She was somewhere in her late 50s, small and quiet, and she fed the stray cats on our block by name. She kept a folding lawn chair on her porch that she used, as far as any of us could tell, mainly to watch the street. The neighborhood had a name for her, the kind of name you land on without ever quite deciding to be cruel about it. We called her the Watcher. On worse days, we called her something less kind than that. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't loud. She simply noticed things and said them out loud, at the wrong times, to the wrong people, in a flat, tired voice that had long since stopped caring whether anyone believed her. My wife, Rachel, brought her a plate of cookies every December, more out of pity than friendship. I waved at her from the driveway. That was the entire relationship for 11 years. A wave, a plate of cookies, a woman on a lawn chair who watched our street like it owed her something. Then Daniel Reyes moved into the rental 2 blocks over, and Eleanor Voss stopped being background noise. I should tell you who I was before Daniel, because it matters. I own a hardware store, my father's before mine, and his father's before that. One of those small businesses that survives by knowing everyone's name and everyone's leaking pipe. I am not, by nature, a suspicious man. I extend credit to people I like. I believe, generally, that most people are exactly what they appear to be. It's a good way to run a hardware store. It turned out to be a dangerous way to run a life. Daniel came into my store on a Tuesday, needing a part for a garbage disposal he'd never installed before. And by the time he left, we'd spent 40 minutes talking like men who'd known each other for years. He had that gift, the kind of warmth that doesn't feel like a technique because it never once seems to be asking you for anything. He was recently divorced, he said, starting over in a new town, looking to build something quiet and normal. He asked about my kids. He remembered their names the next time I saw him. Within a month, he was coming by the store just to talk. Within 2, he'd had dinner at our house 3 times, and Rachel had started saying, with real warmth, that it was nice to see me have a friend like that. I want to be honest. I liked him enormously. That's the part of this story I still find hardest to sit with. The first warning came at Block Barbecue, 6 weeks after Daniel arrived. I was getting a beer from the cooler when Eleanor appeared at my elbow. She rarely came to these things, and I remember being surprised to see her there at all. She didn't say hello. She looked past me, toward Daniel, who was across the yard making my son laugh at something, and she said, in that flat, tired voice, "Don't let that man get close to your family. He's not who he says he is." I laughed. I actually laughed, the reflexive, uncomfortable laugh you give a stranger who said something odd at a party. I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head, said, "You won't believe me. Nobody ever does," and walked back across the street to her lawn chair. I told Rachel about it that night, framing it as a funny story about the Watcher being the Watcher. We laughed about it together. I did not think about it again for 3 weeks. It was the second warning that I couldn't laugh off. I was in my own driveway, alone, loading tools into my truck, when Eleanor crossed the street toward me, which she never did, not in 11 years, and said, without any preamble at all, "Has he mentioned coal insurance yet? A man named Gary Petrosian." I stood there with a socket wrench in my hand and felt something cold move through my chest because the answer was yes. Daniel had, just that week, gently steered a dinner conversation toward the subject of life insurance. How underprotected most families were. How he happened to know an excellent agent, a guy named Gary, who could set Rachel and me up with something smart, something that would take care of the kids, no matter what. I hadn't told a single person that conversation had happened. Not Eleanor. Not anyone. "How do you know that name?" I said, and I heard my own voice come out different than I meant it to. She looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone you've decided, finally, might actually listen. "Because it's always Gary," she said, "or someone with a different name, doing exactly what Gary does. Come to my house. I have something to show you. And bring your wife. So I only have to say this once." We did not bring Rachel. I went alone, that same evening, telling her I was checking on a leaking gutter. I have thought, many times since, about how easily this whole thing could have gone differently if I'd simply been honest with my wife 3 weeks earlier. Eleanor's house, inside, was nothing like the outside suggested. The outside was a tired woman's porch and a folding chair. The inside was a wall, literally a wall, the back wall of her small dining room, covered floor to ceiling in newspaper clippings, printouts, photographs, all connected by threads of red yarn pinned at each end, the kind of thing you see in movies and assume is an exaggeration for effect. It was not an exaggeration. It was 11 years of a woman's life, laid out where she could see it every single day. "Sit down," she said. "I'll try to say this in order." Eleanor had a younger sister named Carol. 22 years ago, Carol had been a newlywed in a town 3 states from here, married to a good, unremarkable man named Peter. And about a year into that marriage, a warm, charismatic stranger had moved into their circle. New in town, recently divorced. Quick to become close with Peter, quicker still to gently suggest that a young couple ought to be better protected, financially, and that he happened to know an agent who could help. For months after the policy was finalized, Peter died in what the county called a hunting accident. A fall, alone, on a trail he'd walked 100 times before. The payout was enormous. The charming new friend had, by then, already left town. A work opportunity, he'd said, very sudden, very sad to be leaving such good friends behind. Carol, Eleanor told me, never recovered. Not from the grief, and not from something worse underneath the grief. A suspicion she could never prove and could never let go of. A suspicion that ate her alive over the following decade until it finally, quietly, killed her too, in the unglamorous way that grief kills people if you let it run long enough. Eleanor buried her sister 9 years ago, and somewhere in that year, going through Carol's things, she found the box. Newspaper clippings her sister had kept, obsessively, for a decade. Because Carol, it turned out, had gone looking for that man's name after his sudden disappearance. And what she'd found was a pattern she'd never had the strength or resources to prove. A different name in a different town, every 3 or 4 years. A charming new arrival. A quick, warm friendship with a family. A gentle conversation about protection, about smart planning, about a good agent. And several months later, always a few states away by the time it happened, an accident. A fall. A car that left the road on a road it had never left before. A boat that capsized on a lake as calm as glass. Eleanor had spent the 9 years since finishing what her sister started. She had followed the pattern from town to town, arriving usually too late, sometimes just in time to watch a family bury someone and never understand why a woman they didn't know was standing at the edge of the service, watching. She had tried, more than once, to warn a family directly, the way she just warned me. She told me what happened every time. They looked at her exactly the way I had, in my driveway, before I saw the wall. Grief, she learned the hard way, does not travel well as a warning. Only proof does, and she rarely arrived with proof in time. His name isn't Daniel Reyes, she said. I don't know what his name actually is. I've had 6 names for him in 9 years. But the pattern doesn't change, because the pattern is the only thing about him that's real. He finds a family. He becomes the best friend the husband ever had. He steers you gently toward a policy, toward an agent who is either paid by him, or is him under one more name. And then, 3 to 6 months after the policy is signed, something happens to the person the policy protects. Usually the husband. He is very patient. He has never once been in a hurry. I asked her, my mouth dry, how close we were to the timeline. She'd already checked. The conversation about Gary Petrosian and Cole Insurance had happened 4 days earlier. If the pattern held, we had somewhere between 2 and 5 months before whatever accident Daniel Reyes was patiently, warmly building toward. I want to tell you that I believed her instantly and completely the moment I saw that wall. I didn't. Even with the wall in front of me, some old, stubborn part of my mind kept reaching for an innocent explanation. Coincidence. A lonely woman's grief curdled into obsession. A story with just enough true bones in it to feel like more than it was. I went home that night unsettled, but not yet certain. I did not sleep, and I did not tell Rachel. Not yet, because I didn't know how to say it out loud without sounding exactly like the woman across the street. What changed my mind wasn't Eleanor. It was Daniel. 2 weeks later, sitting in my own living room, he brought up the policy again, gently, the way he brought up everything, wrapped in concern for my family, no pressure at all, just a friend who cared. And he mentioned, almost as an aside, that Gary could have the paperwork ready within a month if we wanted to lock in the rate before it changed. It was such a small, reasonable thing to say. It was also, I now understood, a clock. That night, once Rachel was asleep, I did the thing I should have done the moment Eleanor said Gary's name. I looked up Cole Insurance. It was real, a real, licensed agency, which almost made it worse, because it meant whatever Daniel was doing had a legitimate business quietly wrapped around it. I looked up Gary Petrosian. His license was real too, but when I looked at the agency's public filings, I found something that made the room go very cold and very quiet around me. Gary Petrosian had only been licensed under that name for 6 years. Before that, through a different state's public records, the kind of thing you find at 2 a.m. when you've stopped being able to convince yourself you're overreacting, a man with Gary's exact face, under a different name entirely, had held an insurance license 3 states over. The same state where Eleanor's brother-in-law had died 22 years ago. I brought it to Eleanor the next morning. I brought Rachel too, finally, sitting her down first, and simply showing her the wall through my phone's photos before she'd even met the woman properly, because I couldn't find the words to say it out loud without proof in her hands first. I watched my wife's face do exactly what mine had done. The disbelief, then the cold arrival of certainty. We spent the next month, the 3 of us, doing the quiet, careful work that Eleanor had never had the resources or the standing to do alone. Rachel, it turned out, had a cousin who worked an insurance fraud investigation for the state, a connection Eleanor, an outsider with no family and no credibility, had simply never had access to in 9 years of trying. Between Eleanor's decade of newspaper clippings, my discovery of Gary's buried former identity, and Rachel's cousin's ability to formally request records instead of just suspecting them, we built, piece by piece, something Eleanor had never been able to build alone. A case a stranger might actually believe. It turned out Gary Petrosian and Daniel Reyes were not accomplices. They were the same man, using 2 faces of the same operation, one name to be your friend, one name to be your agent, so that no single person ever saw both halves of the pattern at once. And it turned out this wasn't his second act, or his 6th. Rachel's cousin found 4 other policies for other towns, for other accidents, going back over 2 decades, all following the exact shape of the wall in Eleanor's dining room. Eleanor's sister's husband had not been his first. He had simply been the first one anyone loved enough to spend a decade looking for him. Here is the part one still think about more than anything else. Once we had enough names, enough records, enough of a pattern laid out for people whose job it was to believe evidence instead of grief, we went to the state investigators together. Not me alone. Eleanor walked in with us, this time not as the strange woman standing at the edge of a funeral, but as the person who had actually built the case from a folding lawn chair for 9 unpaid, unthanked years. Daniel Reyes disappeared 11 days later. The moment, we later learned, that Gary Petrosian's business license came under quiet review. He'd done this before, more than once. The vanishing was as practiced as the arriving. But this time, the trail didn't go cold, because this time there was a decade of Eleanor's documentation sitting in an investigator's file instead of a shoebox in a dead woman's closet. He was found 4 months later in another state, 3 names deep into building the exact same pattern with a different family. Because of the flag Rachel's cousin had placed on his newest alias, were warned before anything happened to them at all. I think about that family sometimes. They will never know Eleanor Voss's name. They have no idea that a woman on a folding lawn chair, 3 states away, spent 9 years making sure a stranger would be watching for the man who was about to become their best friend. He was formally charged, eventually, in connection with 3 of the deaths, including Peter's. It will likely be years before any of it resolves in a courtroom. That part of this story isn't finished, and I won't pretend it is, just to give you a cleaner ending. But something did finish the week the charges were filed. Eleanor Voss stood in Carol's old kitchen. She still kept the house, all these years later, and cried for the first time, she told me, since her sister's funeral. Not from grief, from the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has spent a decade being right, alone, and finally isn't alone in it anymore. We don't call her the Watcher anymore. On our street, that name quietly died sometime around the same week Daniel Reyes did. She still keeps the lawn chair on her porch. She still feeds the cats. But now, some evenings, my son sits out there with her, and Rachel brings the cookies over year-round instead of just at Christmas. And I've come to understand that the woman we spent 11 years being politely embarrassed by had, this entire time, simply been doing the hardest, loneliest, most thankless job there is, telling the truth to people who have already decided not to hear it. It's raining tonight, the same soft, steady rain that was falling the evening I first laughed at a woman for trying to save my family. I think about that laugh more than I'd like to. I think about how many other families, over 22 years, might have had someone standing at their own barbecue, saying something true in a voice nobody wanted to believe. If your life has a person like that in it, the one everyone's quietly decided is a little too much, a little too strange, a little too insistent about something that doesn't concern them, I'd ask you to consider something before you laugh the way I did. Sometimes the crazy ones are simply the only ones who are paying attention. And sometimes, the whole difference between a warning and a tragedy is just one person deciding, for once, to listen before it's too late to matter.